Greetings. I'm John Duvall. Welcome back to another Truth Factor discussion. We hope that you're having a good day. We'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us as we study through the wonderful Word of God. We are currently involved in our study through the Gospel of John. In just a few minutes, we're going to be picking up in the 18th chapter of John, right around verse 12. But let's see, gentlemen, how are you all doing today? Just three of us, or four of us counting me.
I'm doing okay.
Good.
I'm here.
All right, let's see. Caleb, how are things going down in Lawton?
We're going. We're not drowning currently, so that's good.
Well, that's good. That's good. All right, so if you have, first off, a couple of things. If you want to participate in our study, we invite you to do that. You can drop a comment on our Facebook stream or a chat. There's a chat area. You can drop a comment there on the YouTube side of the world. And so if you want to do that, if you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to share them with us, and we'll bring them into, or at least try to bring them into the study today. You can also send us email. You can email us to questions@truthfactorlive.com. or email us individually, like Paul at Brian at Tom at truthfactor.com. I have added Caleb to that mix there. I just haven't put him on the graphic yet. So that's CALEB at truthfactor.com. So if he says anything particularly snarky or something you disagree with, let him know. Let him know. Yeah. All right, let's see who all's joined us today so far. We have Danielle is with us. We have Miss Stephanie is here, and also Jared and Jimmy. And it's good to have everyone with us. Maybe if this is your first time, we'd invite you to chime in and say, hey, I'm Bill from South Dakota or whatever. We'd just love to know that you're with us for today's study. All right, so gentlemen, we left off last week in John chapter 18. We're getting ready to pick up with verse 12 with the detachment of the troops arriving there. Any information you want to share before we actually get into this bulk of the study? Anything? Okay. Let's go ahead and begin with verse 12. Mr. Brian, if you would, let's go ahead and break it up like this. Let's read verses 12 through 14. Just a very short, simple reading right now.
All right. I'll be reading out of the New King James Version. John chapter 18, verse 12. Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people.
All righty. Thank you, Brian. There's a couple of things here in just almost, I don't really say by way of passing, but we have a little bit here. What's the difference between, or what's the relationship or the difference between Annas and Caiaphas?
Well, one's the father-in-law, one's the son-in-law, or
Okay.
that they share the high priesthood in some.
Yeah.
Can I say unscriptural way? It wasn't the design of the law of Moses that it should be like this, but I think it's our understanding. You guys correct me if this is wrong. It was that the Romans had set up a system where it was rotated in and out. I believe it wasn't present, but prior to the Roman occupation.
Yeah,
That's what I think I've
and
heard.
as my understanding, it tied to what Brian said, it had become political, and when I say political, I don't just mean Jewish political. I could see it being political from a Jewish standpoint, considering who Jesus was dealing with all throughout his ministry. I mean, they demonstrated themselves to be very political in the decisions that they made and all that stuff. So, but I think, like Brian said, there's a Roman element to this. It almost seems to me that year, and I'm trying to remember which one it was. I think Caiaphas. It says it was. I think it's Caiaphas was the recognized high priest by Rome,
By
if
Rome,
you will, the interactions with Rome, and Annas actually was the high priest.
by
Because
Leviticus.
the high priest was appointed for life, somewhat like a justice. I guess it's possible that Annas was retired and still maintained the role. but it seems, based on what we read in the Gospels, that Annas definitely still had a influence, and he very much was involved in this. So I kind of see it as one was old-fashioned Jews recognized Annas as the official high priest because again it was supposed to be for life, but the Jews had put Caiaphas in, or the Romans had put Caiaphas in place, and that's what happens when you put politics in the church.
All right. Any thoughts
Is
about
it
that?
is it the Romans that changed it like every year? Or how often were they changing the high priest? You guys remember?
Yeah, I don't remember how often, but I think you're right there, Caleb. The Romans were doing it, and I believe I've even read somewhere, and here we go into guesses, but I believe it was financial also, from the standpoint of
Oh yeah.
that there might have been some greasing of palms or whatever the word that you would use, to jockey for position and be willing to pay so that you could be given that position. Not that ever happens in politics. Politicians are above reproach, and never mind.
This doesn't help a whole lot, but it does add a little bit to it. The ESV Study Bible says, for verse 13, under the Roman procurators, 3 wealthy priestly families largely controlled the extremely important position of high priest. Annas was patriarch of one of those powerful families of high priests. He served as high priest during AD 6 to AD 15, and the high priesthood was subsequently held by 5 of his sons, including his son-in-law Caiaphas. Annas' past stature merited his continued designation as high priest, and even after his disposition, he retained significant control over his family's exercise of this position, so that Luke 3 verse 2 can speak of the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. Josephus mentions a monument of Annas, which has been plausibly identified with a highly decorated tomb found near the brook Kidron. So, for whatever that's worth, I thought that's interesting.
And there's something to be said about that, John. Just kind of as an aside to this, it's fascinating how much history we have available based on the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the elements that made the time that Jesus came to this earth the ideal time. We have plenty of documentation, so we can put a lot of these facts together, or at least guess, or get a good educated guess as to what it should be.
Okay. All right. The other thing, real quick, has to do with his statement there in verse 14, where he mentions, now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And we talked about that a couple of weeks back in regards to the statement that he made. Kind of, it almost sounded prophetic in nature. His point was not so much prophetic, but saying it'd be better for the people for one to die than many to die. But didn't we talk about that being somewhat potentially prophetic as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that goes back to when Caiaphas actually said it. It's at 11:15, I think it is.
Yeah, 11:50.
Yeah, and it was political. It was political the way that Caiaphas meant it, but it has a prophetic and spiritual meaning because it actually had to happen.
Verse 51 of John 11, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one of the children of God who were scattered abroad. So John had made that point about that observation.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Any thoughts or any comments about that? All right. Let me double check on something here real quick. All right, let's see. Any other thoughts about this before we continue forward? Hey, David Clark has joined us for the study today also. All right, let's go ahead and pick up now in verse 15. And Tom, if you would, let's read about Peter's first denial of Jesus. We'll read verses 15 through 18, sir.
All right, okay, and again, I'm reading from the New King James Version. We continue. It says, "And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door, and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, 'You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?' He said, 'I am not.' Now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself."
All right, thank you, Mr. Tom. All right, let's jump back up to verse 15 here for just a second as we get into the situation there. John tells a very interesting story. Now, rephrase that. John's account is more personal, I think, than some of the other Gospels. Because when you read through this, you're going to find, and correct me if I'm wrong in this, maybe I am getting confused with another one, but no, this is it. John tends to go on in with Jesus, and Peter remains behind. And I say that because look there at verse 15. He makes a statement there. "And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest." We believe that disciple was John himself, or at least that was my understanding. "Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest." So here, John goes in with Jesus all the way to the courtyard of the high priest. Peter, on the other hand, he stood at the door outside. And here in a few minutes, we're going to find that John is going to send a young girl to get Peter, to bring Peter on through the door. But we're not, we are there, verse 16. "But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, John, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to her who kept the door, and brought Peter in." This then lays the foundation for the first denial. Tom, in verse 17, why do you think the girl asked this question? Do you think it was more out of, "Are you the one that he wants me to bring in?" Or do you think she genuinely was curious? And I know this is speculation, but something to think about. I don't know if she was really trying to corner him in front of everybody, or if she was curious, or what. Maybe I'm just off target.
John, I've never thought of it from the standpoint of her not knowing who he was. I think there was something about her where she recognized Peter as somebody who had been with Jesus. Of course, you can recognize somebody and think that they were associated with somebody and be wrong about that. So there could be the verification from that standpoint. But it almost seems to me like, and I think that makes the accusation or the warning to Peter and what Peter did even stronger. From the standpoint of, had she somehow recognized him as being one of Jesus's disciples. That's what I see. I also want to say, not too long ago, I preached a sermon dealing with temptation. I actually dealt with this event here, the denial of Peter. And I think you find in this text, you find a process as to what was it that led to the downfall of Peter. And, of course, some of the points that you would make in that is there was pride. There was his pride, telling Jesus, "I will not deny you." And then you find him following Jesus at a distance. And then he comes to the gate of the enemy, and he allows himself to go into the camp of the enemy. And he's cold, and he warms himself at the fire of the enemy, which is what we're going to read next. And that leads to these denials because he's in a place where he's weaker and more vulnerable. And, even being at the door, whoever it is that was keeping the door, he's already in enemy territory. And it makes it more difficult to resist temptation when you put yourself in enemy territory.
All right. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I go back to verse 11. We studied that last week. But it says, Jesus said to Peter, put the sword away into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? So Peter was ready to die. He was ready to fight. And as soon as that's not the case, well, now he's got some doubts. And almost the same way you look at Judas, maybe he thought Christ was going to get out of it because he's gotten out of it so many other times. But it didn't go that way.
Yeah, and I definitely see the same thing there, Caleb. I see the idea of that. I think that Peter was really ready to die, but when Jesus says, "Put your sword away," he doesn't know how to process this. He's thinking on the one-dimensional plane. This is the way I'm thinking, and Jesus is wanting him to think a different way, and so now he's confused. What do I do? But he still, to Peter's credit, in all of this, he was concerned about Jesus. We know John is there. And by the way, the reason John doesn't identify himself by name, and the reason most of us believe it was John, is because if he wrote this letter, he's not seeking self-recognition, which is why he excludes his name. From that standpoint. But here, John is there, and it seems like John's not affected by these threats. I guess because he was known by the people. But then Peter comes along, and he's put himself in this dangerous situation. He doesn't know how to think. He doesn't know how to process this. And if you're struggling with something in your mind, spiritually or something like that, you don't need to go to the camp of the enemy. It's not going to help you. And that's where I see Peter is at in this. But to his credit, he was so concerned about Jesus that at least he wanted to know what was going on. We don't read that about the other apostles. They just completely fled. It's almost like they maybe even kind of gave up.
Okay. All right. I don't know. I'm not trying to disagree, and I do think what you're saying is a good point, but I really think at this moment he was afraid because although John was there, I believe John was there, but John was probably outside of his eyesight. Maybe had gone on in, sent the girl to get him. It's possible Peter was not even aware that John sent the girl; that she just came up and said, "Hey, are you one of his disciples?" And Peter oftentimes spoke. It appears he spoke without thinking oftentimes.
Right. Oh, yeah.
The first one did. Yeah.
And by the way, I agree with you. Peter was afraid. But I think that what contributed to his fear was his uncertainty about what to do.
Yeah.
But yet he was still so concerned about Jesus. At least he wanted to know what was going on. Yeah. So like I said, you can even say that to his credit, but he puts himself in the camp of the enemy, and don't discount the part of Satan in this, And I'm not taking away the responsibility of Peter. I think Peter was responsible, but don't discount what Satan is doing in this too, because Jesus warned Peter, it's going to happen. And Satan's the one that's doing this to you. Satan's the one that's put you in this situation. He's got you at a vulnerable spot. And by the way, that's where he goes. He's called a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour for a reason in 1 Peter chapter 5. And of course, the whole point of that verse, I think 1 Peter 5:8. I think the whole point of that verse is Satan isn't looking for the strong one. He's looking for that straggler. He's looking for that weak prey that he can devour. And at this moment, Peter's weak.
Yeah. All right. Any thoughts on this before we move into the next section there?
Yeah, I had one comment. I'm sorry, Caleb, you want to go ahead?
I was going to say Jerry had a comment, but go ahead.
All right, go ahead, Brian, and then I'll bring in Jerry's.
Yeah. I was going to say this. One of the things that strikes me about this situation is that I'm really struck by how uncomfortable or how hard it must have been for Peter in this moment, because I think of it like this. Peter has just attacked one of these guys and cut one of their ears off. And imagine, let's move it to the 21st century. Imagine a bunch of police officers came to arrest somebody and you pulled out a gun and shot one of them. And of course, then your master healed the man. But still, how do the police feel about somebody pulling out a gun and shooting you and then running off? And so you can imagine these guys are sitting around talking about, yeah, one of those guys pulled a sword and cut my, and he kind of looks like that guy right there that did it. You know, it's incredible that Peter is right there with the people that, it seems pretty clear that the language is using that these are the guards and maybe the very guards that have come to arrest Jesus before. And here's Peter, the guy that attacked him with a sword and wounded someone. I'm just always struck by as I said, if I, followed somebody to a police station after I had shot a police officer, could you imagine those police officers that I'd shot are standing around, talking about it, and there I am in the middle of them? I mean, that would just be, and like I said, when I think of that, I think of the idea that lying almost seems like denying Jesus, it almost seems like the thing that anybody would have done. It's hard for me not to imagine that kind of thing in this scenario where he's in the middle of this group and he's already just attacked them once before and was, disarmed and, or the whole attack was dismissed. I'm sure these guys are, would love to get a hold of the guy that attacked them earlier. I'm sure that's got to be something that they've crossed their mind. So I was thinking Peter's situation here and just how bizarre it is that now he's been brought in to stand among them, they're all sitting at the fire, warming their hands and, hey, aren't you the guy that, was there earlier? And, I get the impulse, the overwhelming impulse would be to lie about it. And so I see that.
Yeah. And consider that this is what likely Thursday night, late Thursday night, maybe early Friday morning. If you go with the Friday crucifixion and from that standpoint, these were not just people that were out for a stroll on Thursday night and they stumbled across a group of people and wanted to see what was going on. These were the enemies. They were there with a purpose. And I get in our next point, I think we need to at least briefly touch on the trial itself and so on. But this was planned. And I think everybody there was a part of the plan, which means they were all a part of the enemies, from that standpoint. And that's where Peter finds himself.
Okay. All right. Before we move on, I want to bring in Jerry. Jerry points out that in the English Standard Translation, it reads as in verse 17, the servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" And I think that's an interesting way of wording it, because John had sent her to get Peter, and she steps out. He walks through the door, and she says, "Aren't you one of his disciples too?" And Peter, of course, he should have embraced it. He should have said, "I am. Where's my brother John?" or whoever. Yeah, I mean, that would be my guess at what he should have said. But he was right off the bat says, "I'm not." All right, any thoughts? Thank you, Jerry.
Well, you kind of wonder, what did John say to her? Hey, go get the other disciple. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
And she's looking for the other disciple, but she lets Peter in. So
yeah. So either he pointed it out directly, go grab that guy, or go grab the fellow by the name of Peter. I don't know. He's the one that's got a mole right up here up over his eye. And he's really got a shaky hand because he swung a sword earlier. I don't know.
But it is clearly, I think it is clearly the other disciple, which we all believe is John.
Yeah. I think it's most reasonable.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, that being said, let's go ahead and continue now with verse 19. And Mr. Brian, would you mind reading for us? Let's start in verse 19 and let's go ahead and read through verse 24. Let's look at kind of the first section as John records it of the trial.
Okay, reading again from the New King James Version, verse 19 of John 18.
Wait a minute, Brian. Who read a while ago? I'm sorry.
I read, and then Topham read. And so Caleb's up next. I just, but I figured you just don't like Caleb and wanted to skip it. That was where I,
No, Brian just wants to hog the show. So
yeah, well, it's my mellifluous voice.
All right, so I'm gonna go with Caleb. Sorry, I thought
I'm
Caleb
gonna
read
read the-
first, but he didn't.
Doesn't bother me.
Go ahead, Caleb.
Well, I'm going to read from the New American Standard Version because it's so much better than the New King.
Oh yeah, see that this is why we don't ask you to read, Caleb, because
Yeah.
you just go off and
yeah, you just
I took it
you're
as a
reading for
personal
the last
offense.
time now. So
And you prefer the 2020?
95.
All right, go ahead and read 19 through 24 if you would, please.
Yeah. It says, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. So why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. And when Jesus had said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, Is that the way you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered him, If I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me? So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, so let's back up then for just a moment to verse 19 there. So we have the high priest questioning Jesus about his disciples and about his teachings. His response is quite interesting, wasn't it, Caleb?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, it kind of goes back to the point we made earlier about the high priest. You know, which one is the high priest? Because the high priest questioned him. Then he sends him to Caiaphas, the high priest. So it's interesting. You know, we have multiple high priests who, according to the Romans. So, you know, the Jews and the Romans, they see it differently.
And so
But
this is
it's
Annas
interesting.
talking to him right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the Jews see him as the high priest, right? Caiaphas is seen by the Romans as the high priest, but he's, you know, the son-in-law, so they all answer to the patriarch, I guess, who they all recognize as the real high priest, which
Okay.
is interesting.
All right, so Jesus says, I've spoken openly to the world. I also taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. So he's wanting to know, why are you questioning me? You know, ask those who
Yeah,
heard
I
me.
mean, well, it's an illegitimate trial, Jesus points out, because they all know what he's teaching. You already know
highly
what I taught.
illegal.
And you know, they try and incriminate him and his disciples. You know, he's defending his disciples too. You know, they're innocent because he's the one that spoke these things. And you can go ask all the people what I spoke. So don't you know, pin it on me and the disciples. You know, I spoke it. These
Yeah.
people heard it.
Yeah, you go ask them what it is I taught. All right, Brian, you
Yeah,
got any
and-
thoughts on this? Or Tom?
Yeah. And you know, tying into that, you know, you've also got the idea, I spoke to you openly in the synagogue. I think Jesus is saying to the very witnesses, you know, or to the enemy, you know, those in this group, he said, you've heard me. You've heard what I've said. By the way, that's the reason I'm here. And all they're looking for is a straight, they just want that straightforward yes, which Jesus is going to give it to them, but he's not ready. Jesus is showing that he is still in control, number one. And number two, and like Caleb mentioned, you know, this trial's illegal. I mean, everything is illegal about what is happening here. I looked up this morning because of this. I looked up an article at Crosswalk that lists 10 reasons why this trial was illegal. And since this is going to lead into what we're talking about, let me just read them off. I'm not going to comment a whole lot. But the bottom line is he should have never been arrested in the first place because there was no formal charge. Secondly, legal proceedings were not supposed to take place at night. And here we are in the middle of the night. no trial for a capital offense could begin on a Friday or the day before an annual feast, and that's what they're trying to condemn him of. Number 4, a trial for a capital offense needed to take more than one day. There needed to be a pause, and you're going to find it didn't happen. Number 5, the judges were not impartial. Number 6, the indictment against Jesus, they were false or unproven. Number 7, the verdict was unanimous, and that's a rabbinical discussion or a Jewish discussion. There had to be a defender for the. There had to be somebody there to defend the defendant, and if there was nobody there, it was not a legitimate trial. And because of that, number 8, Jesus was not given a defense. Number 9, a death sentence could not be passed, or could only be passed in a legal court. Here we are in the house of Annas, and he has to be carried away to Caiaphas. And so I think what Annas is doing is fishing. He's fishing for Jesus to make that one statement so he can send him, quote unquote, officially to Caiaphas to be condemned. And then the 10th one is they switch the charges. When they condemn him to death and they send him to Pilate, they switch the charge from blasphemy to insurrection, because Pilate could have cared less about blasphemy.
All right. That's a good list there. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's great to kind of consider some of these things. One of the things you're probably, a lot of people are probably remembering, is that there's a similar situation in Acts 23 where they also struck Paul at the Sanhedrin. While he's giving testimony, they strike him, and Paul, Paul responds, very, I guess it's a big question, and I think it probably was inappropriately that Paul responded, because Paul seems to take it back. But, Jesus doesn't respond inappropriately when they strike Jesus. Jesus, says, well, why are you hitting me? Why would you do that? It's very interesting how meek, not timid, but meek Jesus is in the midst of a moment that later on, when it happens to Paul, he's outraged. I think any of us would be outraged. I mean, if you went to court, you start to give your defense, and somebody comes up and slugs you, the bailiff does, you'd be upset, you'd be angry, and Jesus is in complete control of himself. Paul goes to an outburst, it seems like, and Paul's a pretty strong example of self-control. I think any of us would, and Jesus is being this way. I think the thing that always strikes me, though, and you said this before, and it's a point when I talk about this area, I like to emphasize this a lot, is that this case has been cobbled together. A few hours before, this guy shows up and says, hey, we got to arrest him right now, because this is our only chance, because Jesus just called Judas on, Judas, I know what you're doing, and Judas runs out the door and says, it's now or never. And I'm sure they're thinking, now it's the Passover, we've got things going on. It'd be like Christmas Eve, now I've got everybody here, and we don't even have a case. And so they arrest Jesus without a case, as Tom said. I can't stress enough how remarkable that is. They arrest Jesus without a case, without they haven't got anything lined up. They haven't got their witnesses. They're going to have to fabricate everything. And I think they're kind of dragging their feet in these hours, trying to say, well, what are we going to do? I mean, we got him. Now what? And if it weren't, and I believe in Matthew. Now we're going to jump right out of the trial of the Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. This morning, Caleb kind of showed me something I hadn't really noticed before, that there seems to be a distinction between what happens at Caiaphas's house and the Sanhedrin, and I think that was really neat. But the whole point is, we're going to skip all of that. We're going to go straight to Pilate here in just a few minutes. We're not even going to talk about this trial, which is interesting, because what you get out of Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that the trial fell apart. As they're putting it together, their witnesses are a mess, and they're like, we're losing, until somebody finally says, well, why don't we just ask him? Why don't we just ask Jesus? And Jesus says, I'll tell you exactly what this is. Jesus saves their case. Jesus, they were, I think they were on the verge of it all falling apart and them letting Jesus go. And Jesus gives them the testimony that they claim to have needed. You're right. I am the Christ. That's exactly right. Oh, he just said it. We don't have to have the witnesses now. And so it's really, to me, Tom said something I like to talk about a lot, the illegality of this trial, the outrageously poorly put together nature of this trial. The only reason this worked is because God made it work. Jesus made it work. Jesus is the one who kept this case together for them. They had fallen apart by the time they were bringing everything together, and Jesus is the only reason that they can keep this trial going and moving along. So to me, I'm overwhelmed and struck by that. Just how absurd this trial was, how absurdly put together it was, how it fell apart, and how Jesus is the only one that keeps it together, and yet he's also utterly meek and utterly humble. I mean, like I said, if you weren't reading it right here, it would be almost impossible to figure out a way that those two extreme paradoxes could happen. Somebody could bring about their own trial, they could make it work, and at the same time be utterly meek and utterly humble throughout it. Unless you were reading it right here, I couldn't imagine of a way it could happen.
Most of us have heard the expression kangaroo court. And the idea is a court proceeding that's an absolute joke. And this is the perfect example of a trial. There was just nothing legal about this trial. So, but other than it had to happen. And it had to happen not because Jesus was guilty, but because we are. And let's never forget that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very good point. All right.
Well,
go ahead, Caleb.
Isn't it said that the chief priests and the scribes didn't want Jesus to be sacrificed on the Passover? Like, that was like...
Right. That's the one
clear.
thing they said. Yeah. You're right, Caleb. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Caleb, but you're so right. I mean, that was their one caveat. We got to do this, but the one thing we need to make sure is we don't do it during the Passover. Yeah, that's what's incredible.
That's Matthew 26, 3-5. Yeah, let's make sure we don't do it here. So I think your point's well made that they did not plan for that to happen right now. And maybe the point of Judas getting called out, maybe you're right. Hey, this is it. But he knows. Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
I've got that highlighted now, what you were talking about, Matthew 26, 3-5. Where they said, but not during the feast. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right, good points. Good points. Any other thoughts? Let's take just a second and we'll discuss briefly about Jesus' response to the officer. So the Annas didn't order the hitting, okay, if you would. The officer seems to view Jesus as being, I'm not sure what the term is, but presumptuous, whatever, and he strikes him because he's rebuking the high priest effectively. Because basically saying, why don't you ask the witnesses, people who heard me? So when they strike Jesus and they say, do you answer the high priest that way? His answer is real simple. If I've spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? There was some movie years ago, and I can't remember what the movie was, but this person was supposed to knock someone out, and it's kind of a comedy. So he goes and strikes the other person, and the person says, why'd you hit me? Yeah. And but this is kind of what Jesus says to him. If I didn't deserve it, why did you hit me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Yeah. All right, any thoughts?
I think it's important to note, what Jesus says. It's something we should all say. If something, somebody brings an offense or a charge against you, it's like, well, what have I done? Lay it out for me. Make it known. And let's go from there. And it's really wise words that Jesus spoke. What have I done wrong? Lay it out. Yeah. And of course they don't. They got nothing. They send him to Caiaphas. Well, maybe he sends them to Caiaphas so we can try and get some things in order. Let's get some more time. Go send him over to the real high priest. The real high priest over here, and not deal with me.
If Caiaphas was somewhat connected to the Roman government, do you think this would be considered the next step in getting him up the chain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, after Caiaphas, Jesus is gathered before the entire council. So they finally dug and they finally got what they wanted, and conveniently, I mean, remember they didn't have phones, they didn't have cell phones, but isn't it interesting that the council is available? I mean, they're just available to assemble. And again, none of this is recorded in John because it was in the other Gospels. And so John, and remember that John is writing this Gospel with the assumption that people were familiar with at least some of the other Gospels.
Yeah. That's a good point. All right, any other thoughts on this? All right, let's see. All right, we're going to hit the next section, beginning verse 25, where Peter, second opportunity he has to confess that he knows Jesus and is one of his disciples there. We have Marcia. She's joined us for the study. Also, Jared dropped this comment about the same time, Brian, as you were talking earlier, but basically saying the same thing there. It's like they didn't have a game plan to arrest Jesus. Yeah. I hadn't really looked at it that way, but that's a very good point, that Jesus calling Judas out, telling him to go ahead and get it done, may have precipitated the events. He knows about the plan. We got to get it going or something. Okay. This next section, let's start in verse 25. And Tom, it looks like we've cycled back around to you. Let's read, if you would, verses 25 through 27, sir, of the New King James Version.
Yes, the New King James. Yes.
Go ahead, sorry.
Thou art correct. Now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, You are not also one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, Did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter then denied again, and immediately a rooster crowed.
All right, so in this particular, in this gospel, we have the final two kind of back to back there. And Peter was still standing around warming himself. We saw that earlier in the text there. And someone else posed the question, You are not also one of his disciples, are you? And of course he denies it. Here's the problem. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we don't think about our answer. We are maybe prompted by emotion or something, and we don't stop and weigh what we are saying. We are not, as James says, what is it? Slow to speak, and slow to wrath, or quick to hear and slow to wrath. So you would think after the first time, maybe the bells would go off in Peter's head. Surely after the second time, in the back of his mind, Peter would be yelling at himself, saying, wait, But it doesn't. And then in verse 26, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man who cut off his ear. He says, and this goes back to who was it talking about earlier? Brian, didn't I see you in the garden with him? Kind of maybe he was worried about those standing around who could be able to point the finger at him, and they do effectively. And of course, Peter denies them. Any thoughts?
Yeah, interestingly, Mark's account, Mark is the gospel that records that the rooster is going to crow twice, and it tells you, and this is Mark 14:68. It makes after the first time he denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you are saying. He went out in the porch and a rooster crowed. And I find that the fact that that's mentioned in Mark's gospel, and those who have done background studies kind of understand that Mark's gospel is very likely tied to Peter. Mark was associated with Peter. And so very likely it was tied to Peter. And so Peter is the one that is recounting this detail for Mark to write it down. And the fact that it's mentioned there that first time, at least to me, it implies that Peter heard that rooster the first time. And Jesus said he's going to crow twice. And so he hears it the first time, and I could see Peter after that first time saying, okay, you know, I need to be more alert. I need to be more alert. But yet he keeps going toward the fire and warming himself toward the fire and puts himself in the more difficult situation. And then he denies him again the second, third time. And so you have that. Incidentally, one of the things, and I know we don't have time to deal with this, but you read the 4 accounts of the denial, and there are some statements that are challenging. You know, at what point did what take place? It seems that the first 2 denials were relatively close to each other. The third one happens a little bit later, and this is from tying them all together. And there's some things about who said what and when and all those types of things. And a critic of the text might sit there and say you've got all kinds of conflicts and stuff. But what you have is 4 different witnesses, all testifying to the same event, that these things happened. All 4 gospels. What do they agree on? They agree on the fact that Jesus, or that Peter, denied Jesus 3 times, and they record the 3 times. All 4 gospels do that. You know, if you study eyewitness accounts, J. Warner Wallace, he's good about this. He's got a book. He's got a book out there dealing with apologetics, who Jesus is, based on being a cold case detective in Los Angeles. And he makes the point, if you have 4 witnesses and they all say the exact same thing in the exact way, there's a good chance that they corroborated. So if there's not a little bit of variant in the accounts, that's pretty much an indication that you've got a conspiracy. And so I find it remarkable that the 4 gospels, and there's ways to reconcile the things that they said, but you've got different ways that it's put together. And so I think that's an interesting point about tying all these things together. Bottom line is, a rooster crowed after Peter denied him the 3rd time. And if you go to Luke's account, which I think is the absolute most chilling of these things, where it says after that rooster crowed, he was within eye shot of Jesus, and Jesus looked at him. And he realized it, and he went out and he wept bitterly. And John doesn't record that because it's already documented.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting when you look at that account in Luke, and it says the Lord looked at him, and then he remembered. So there's all these things going on, and he, you know, we keep thinking, well, maybe, you know, I've denied him twice. Maybe I'm really thinking about it, but it seems he doesn't remember that until he sees Jesus in the rooster crows, and then he remembers. But I think that's interesting that it makes that distinction of, you know, Jesus made this statement, but he had forgotten about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. Let's see, Brian, any other thoughts on this?
No, it's great stuff. It's just I'm always struck by Peter's denial, and it's very understandable. I would say, you know, Jimmy Ray has a really great comment in there, just that, you know, what would we do if, you know, the gun's to our head? And the thing that strikes me is that if you didn't have a moment to think about it, you're right on the spot. It's the flesh. I mean, the fleshly instinct is to lie for self-preservation. You know, and like I said, Peter was ready to fight before. I don't doubt Peter's bravery or his commitment, but the whole point was, as Jesus said in the garden just a few hours before, your flesh is willing, your spirit is willing, but your flesh is weak. That's Peter. I mean, it's, you know, and that's Brian too. I mean, if I was in that situation, I didn't have a chance to think, and they put the gun to my head. You know, we're going to Jesus' disciples? No, you know, you just might react without even thinking about it. You know, Peter's situation is really profound, and I'm going to go look up Tom's sermon about this because it sounds pretty good. The idea to think about us putting ourselves in situations where, you know, we're so tangled up with the world that, you know, getting away from it is is almost impossible for us, that it feels like anyway. I really like that idea, Tom, and I'm going to go look that up because there's just something profound about Peter's denial, that a few hours before Peter had swore it wasn't going to happen. Peter couldn't even imagine it happening, and here he is doing it. And Peter is an extraordinary disciple. What a lesson for all of us, right? I mean, Peter's denial ought to be a profound lesson that every one of us needs to think about, that, that in the end, we all of us get challenged, and all of us mess up. And one of the things that I've always been the most remarkable about this whole story is what Jesus said in Luke, whenever Jesus makes a statement right before this, and when you come back, the implication being, you're not going to pass this test. God, Satan has asked you to sift you like wheat. God knew what was about to happen. God knew Peter was going to fail. God still had a plan for Peter, even knowing Peter was going to fail. That, to me, is one of the most encouraging things I think about in being a disciple of Jesus Christ. God has it in, and I'm going to say this carefully. I don't mean to sound like, I'm saying sin doesn't matter. But God even has it in his plan that sometimes I'll mess up, and he still has a place for me. He still has a job for me to do. And I get a lot of courage out of that.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we sometimes judge these disciples harshly. We're not walking in their shoes. I mean, you have to factor that in. I mean, would I have done differently? And I think it's a thought-provoking question. And you know what? Maybe there are some that wouldn't. But probably the most of us, if we're not careful. I mean, remember, that's what Peter said. I won't do it. And he did. So let him who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall.
Even Nicodemus had a challenge.
Oh, yeah.
It's coming to Jesus by night, and then when he at least appears to speak up for Jesus, they're like, what, are you one of his disciples also? Hey, here's a sermon idea. I think it's a sermon idea. The situation with Peter is much like us within a local church. Okay, when Peter was with Jesus and the other apostles, it's very easy to be bold, to speak boldly. Okay, but when you're by yourself, when you're all alone at that moment, therein where the challenge comes in. And that's kind of a way representative of sorts with us we come together and assemble with the saints, and we have great conversations, and we know to be strong. But then when we go home and we are being tempted, when we are alone or in a small group or with a group that pressures whatever, do we act like Peter, or do we act like Paul, who confronted Peter? I don't know. I mean, it's just something to think about as a comparison there. Let's see real quick, and then we'll pull it to a close here. Jared Dart says, just imagine if Peter never denied, but he did. And that's that. The fact that Peter denied Jesus will help us understand the last chapter of John and the conversation that Peter has with Jesus. And it teaches us a lot about the fact, and they've already touched on it, how we come back from it. And then let's see, boy, you got several comments came in there. Sorry. Jimmy says, I've often said and believe every time that you sin, you've done the same as Peter. You have denied Jesus. To that, Danielle says, but if we choose to deny and you're killed anyway, you would be lost. We need to always choose correctly. And then Brian shares a sermon, and so does Tom as well. And then Jared says, in all honesty, we all have been in Peter's shoes. There's no such thing as a perfect Christian. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts or comments? Good points.
Well, I think about, I don't know if you guys have hymns for worship, but 604 is I'm the one. And it talks about we're all the one that crucified Jesus because we denied him. And, it just goes back to Isaiah 53 and verse 6. It says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We've all turned to our own way, but the Lord hath laid on him all iniquity. So,
That's
it was
good
prophesied thousands of years ago that this is going to happen.
And it did.
And
It
we're no better than them.
Yeah.
I think a good place to stop, John, I don't know, is looking at Luke 22 at the account there before the Sanhedrin, because John skips ahead. But you take it from a religious trial, a religious complaint, to a legal one in Luke. And where we're going to pick up next week is, or in 2 weeks, before Pilate, is it becomes a legal issue with the Romans because he claims to be king. So it no longer is just a religious trial. It becomes a legal trial.
Yeah.
And much what Brian said earlier, he saves their case and he gives them exactly what they need, which, goes back to Christ. Jesus is going to die on the cross. He already knows that's the plan of God, and he's going to make sure that happens. And it just goes to show you that it's more willing sacrifice than it is they had all control and they were going to force him to.
Yeah.
And what's incredible is that Pilate's going to be astounded. Pilate's going to say, hey, I could stop this right now. Why aren't you helping me stop this? And Jesus won't help Pilate stop the trial. Jesus helps them make the case to keep the trial, and Jesus won't help Pilate stop the trial. And Pilate just is astounded. Why? I mean, don't you get what's going on here? It really is incredible.
Yeah.
Right. And the bottom line is he did it in his time.
That's right.
Jesus was in control the entire time.
All right. Good comments. Let's plan to go ahead and stop for today's study at verse 28 of John 18. Caleb, that is an interesting idea about if we want to take a few minutes at the beginning of our next study to look at the portion of the trial that John kind of skips over. I think we've touched on it. It's been referenced a time or two. But if I can remember, and we could plan to do that in our next study, which is 2 weeks. I need to go ahead and say this. We won't have a study next week. I'm going to be out of town, and so we'll continue our study the following Thursday after that, which should put it on the 29th. I believe it is the 29th. So you have 2 weeks to think about this. 2 weeks. All right. Any other thoughts or comments about it? I appreciate all the comments in the chat room. Appreciate your participation. And I really appreciate your interest in these things. Real quick, if you want to contact us, you can send us an email. Send it to questions@truthfactorlive.com or email us individually. It's just our first name. In Tom's case, it's the shorter version of it, tom@truthfactor.com. And definitely we would love to hear from you. All right, gentlemen, that's it for today's study. We'll pick it up in 2 weeks. John chapter 18. Verse 28, roughly, is where we'll begin. I appreciate everyone's attention and participation, and we'll, of course, see everyone in 2 weeks. Y'all have a great one. Bye-bye.